Shanice never expected the warning to come the way it did. Sharp, trembling, and laced with a fear she had never seen in her mother's eyes before. But the moment her mother uttered the words, "Stay away from him," everything Shanice thought she understood about Ted, about love, about safety, and even about her own family history began to unravel in a way that would change her forever on beyond the gates. Because this wasn't the kind of warning born from casual disapproval or protective instinct. This was the kind of warning forged in buried trauma, unspoken regrets, and sins that had been locked away for decades. And as Shanice stood frozen in the doorway of their Fairmont Crest home, clutching her phone with Ted's unread message glowing on the screen, her mother's voice cracked as she repeated the command again, louder this time, more desperate, as if saying it twice might somehow shield her daughter from a fate she herself had narrowly survived. And Shanice, confused and defensive, pushed back immediately, insisting that Ted wasn't who her mother thought he was, that he was kind, attentive, supportive in ways no one else had ever been. But that only made her mother recoil further, shaking her head as tears welled up, because she knew something Shanice didn't, something she had prayed would never resurface, something that Ted's reappearance in their lives had violently dragged back into the light. And as the argument escalated, the truth began to spill out in fragments. Half-finished sentences, gasped confessions, and memories that tasted bitter even after all these years, revealing that Ted was not just a man from Shanice's present, but a ghost from her mother's past, a man who once promised everything and delivered devastation, a man whose charm masked a pattern of manipulation that left scars no apology could erase. And when Shanice demanded specifics, demanded proof, demanded to know why she should walk away from someone she loved based on vague warnings and unresolved history, her mother finally broke, confessing that Ted had once nearly destroyed her life, that he had lied, controlled, and abandoned her at her most vulnerable moment, and that the worst part wasn't what he did, but how easily he did it again and again to women who believed they were the exception. And Shanice's heart pounded as the realization hit that her mother wasn't speaking from jealousy or fear of losing control over her daughter's choices. She was speaking from experience. And still Shanice hesitated, torn between the woman who raised her and the man who made her feel seen. But the tension deepened when her mother dropped the bombshell that Ted knew things about Shanice he should not know, that his interest in her hadn't been as coincidental as he'd claimed, that he had been watching, waiting, and positioning himself into her life with calculated precision. A revelation that sent a chill down Shanice's spine as past conversations replayed in her mind, moments she had dismissed as curiosity now twisting into something far more sinister. And when Shanice confronted Ted later that night, hoping desperately for reassurance, his reaction only confirmed her mother's fears, because instead of denying the accusations outright, Ted deflected, softened his tone, told her she was overreacting, subtly planting doubt in her perception. And that was the moment Shanice felt the ground shift beneath her, realizing with horrifying clarity that her mother had once stood exactly where she was now, making excuses, filling in the gaps with hope, and ignoring the warning signs until it was almost too late. And as word of the confrontation spread through Fairmont Crest, whispers began circulating, with old names resurfacing and long-dormant grudges reigniting, as other women quietly came forward with stories eerily similar to Shanice's mother's, painting a pattern that could no longer be ignored. And still Ted maintained his composure in public, presenting himself as the wronged party, insisting he was being punished for mistakes he'd already paid for. But behind closed doors his mask slipped, revealing flashes of the same controlling behavior that had once trapped Shanice's mother. And when Shanice finally returned home, shaken and heartbroken, her mother didn't say, "I told you so." She simply held her daughter as they both cried, knowing that the damage had been done but hoping it wasn't irreversible. And yet the fallout was only beginning, because Ted was not a man who accepted rejection quietly, and his obsession with Shanice only intensified as she pulled away, leading to increasingly unsettling encounters that forced Shanice to confront the terrifying reality that love can sometimes be the most dangerous disguise of all. And as Beyond the Gates builds toward its next explosive chapter, the warning, "Stay away from him," echoes louder than ever, not just as a mother's plea, but as a haunting reminder that the past never truly stays buried, that cycles repeat when truths are ignored, and that sometimes the most important warnings are the ones we don't want to hear until it's almost too late. The warning doesn't end there. If anything, it metastasizes, because after that night, the phrase "stay away from him" becomes a kind of living presence in Shanice's mind, echoing through every hallway of Fairmont Crest and every quiet moment when she's alone. And the more she tries to move forward, the more the truth about Ted presses in from all sides on beyond the gates, as her mother finally begins to tell the rest of the story she's spent decades burying, revealing that Ted didn't just break her heart all those years ago. He systematically isolated her from friends, subtly rewrote her memories until she doubted her own instincts, and vanished the moment she needed him most, leaving her to rebuild her life in silence and shame, convinced that if she ever spoke his name again, he would somehow reappear to finish what he started. And Shanice listens in horror as she realizes the similarities between her mother's past and her own recent experiences are too precise to be coincidence. The same carefully chosen compliments, the same moments of jealousy disguised as concern, the same way Ted always seemed to know exactly what to say to make her feel guilty for questioning him. And as this realization sinks in, Shanice begins pulling away more decisively, canceling plans, ignoring calls, reclaiming pieces of herself she didn't realize she'd handed over. But Ted senses the shift immediately, his calm facade cracking just enough to reveal the volatility beneath, and when he confronts Shanice in a public setting, lowering his voice while tightening his grip on her arm just long enough to leave a message without witnesses, it becomes clear that her mother's fear wasn't exaggerated. It was restrained, and the incident sends shockwaves through the community, forcing Shanice to finally speak up, even though doing so terrifies her, because Ted is respected, connected, and very good at playing the victim. And when Shanice's accusations surface, he counters with charm and wounded indignation, suggesting she's confused, overwhelmed, or being manipulated by a mother who never got over him, and that tactic nearly works, sowing doubt among friends and allies who once cheered the relationship. But what Ted doesn't anticipate is the ripple effect of truth, because once Shanice breaks her silence, others find the courage to break theirs too, women from different eras of his life stepping forward with stories that form a devastating mosaic of emotional abuse, control, and abandonment, forcing even Ted's staunchest defenders to reconsider everything they thought they knew. And as pressure mounts, Ted grows reckless, his obsession with maintaining control over the narrative pushing him into increasingly erratic behavior that only confirms Shanice's worst fears. And when he shows up uninvited at her mother's house, claiming he just wants closure, the confrontation that follows is explosive, decades of suppressed rage colliding with fresh betrayal as Shanice's mother finally looks Ted in the eye and tells him he no longer has power over her or her child, a moment that feels like both a reckoning and a release. And yet the danger doesn't vanish overnight, because men like Ted rarely disappear quietly, and as legal questions, social fallout, and emotional scars continue to unfold, Shanice is left grappling with the aftermath of loving someone who was never who he claimed to be, while also reckoning with a deeper truth about generational trauma and the cost of silence. And in the end, the warning "stay away from him" becomes more than a command. It becomes a catalyst, a painful but necessary turning point that forces Shanice to choose herself, to believe women when they speak, and to understand that survival sometimes begins with listening to the voices that tremble when they tell the truth, as Beyond the Gates barrels toward its next chapter with Ted's secrets exposed, Shanice's strength tested, and a mother and daughter bound together by the hard-won knowledge that love should never require fear to survive. Even after the confrontation, even after the legal threats, even after the whispered warnings of friends who had witnessed Ted's subtle manipulations and the silent alarms that rang through the corridors of Fairmont Crest, Shanice couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from over, because Ted, now exposed but far from defeated, began a campaign of subtle intimidation, leaving messages that were too vague to be actionable but too pointed to ignore, showing up at places she frequented, standing at the edge of her vision just long enough to make her pulse race. And while the community murmured about coincidence and paranoia, Shanice's mother knew better, seeing in Ted's calculated movements the same patterns that had nearly destroyed her. Patterns of obsession that twisted charm into menace, love into leverage, and every small act into a trap designed to test boundaries and erode confidence. And as Shanice struggled to rebuild her sense of normalcy, she found herself questioning everything she had ever trusted, every friend, every casual compliment, every decision she had made while under Ted's influence, because the more she tried to put distance between herself and him, the more the tendrils of his presence seemed to reach, manifesting in intercepted messages, unexplained coincidences, and the haunting feeling that someone was always watching, listening, waiting, a relentless reminder that he thrived on control. And in the darkest nights, when she lay awake thinking of her mother's warning, of the life her mother had painstakingly reconstructed after his betrayal, she realized that fear had a new name, that vigilance had a new shape, and that the battle ahead wasn't just about breaking ties. It was about reclaiming her life from someone who had made it his mission to manipulate, confuse, and entrap. And as she began to strategize, seeking allies in unexpected corners, old friends who had also felt Ted's subtle influence, neighbors who had noticed his patterns, even colleagues who had heard the whispered stories, Shanice started to assemble a network of protection, a support system that her mother hadn't had when she was younger, a means of fighting back with awareness rather than anger. And yet, every step forward seemed matched by a step from Ted in the shadows. His presence felt even when unseen, his influence slipping into conversations and encounters like a dark undercurrent, forcing Shanice to navigate every interaction carefully, to measure every word, every gesture, every social media post, because the man who had once charmed and deceived her mother now stalked the edges of her life with precision, and each revelation about his past, stories of manipulation, betrayal, and broken promises, only made her more determined, more alert, more unwilling to succumb to the charm he wielded like a weapon. And when she finally confronted him publicly at a community event, the air thick with tension, the whispers of onlookers amplifying every movement, she saw in his eyes a flicker of the old arrogance, the old sense of entitlement, and realized that his obsession had not waned with exposure, that the more she resisted, the more he sought to assert dominance. And in that moment, Shanice's resolve crystallized, fueled not just by fear, not just by her mother's warnings, but by the fierce knowledge that survival meant asserting control over her own story, that she would not be drawn into his web, that she would stand tall even as he tried to undermine her, even as the community watched, even as memories of her mother's pain resurfaced, because for Shanice, staying away from him was no longer just a matter of caution, it was a declaration, a lifeline, a testament to the power of listening to the voices that care. And as Beyond the Gates hurtled forward, every shadowed encounter, every whispered rumor, every small victory over Ted's influence became part of a larger tapestry, a story of empowerment and resilience, proving that even in a world rife with deception and danger, knowing when to walk away, knowing whose warnings to heed, and knowing how to reclaim your life could transform fear into strength and pain into resolve, ensuring that the warning her mother gave would echo not as a threat, but as a legacy of survival, vigilance, and the unbreakable bond between mother and daughter. But even as Shanice began to piece together a semblance of safety, the reality of Ted's obsession proved impossible to fully escape, because every corner of Fairmont Crest seemed to hold a reminder of his presence, from the familiar cars parked too long outside her mother's house to the cryptic notes left in places she frequented, each one carrying just enough ambiguity to unsettle her without providing proof. And as the days bled into nights filled with restless sleep and haunted memories, she realized that Ted had not only infiltrated her physical space, but had begun to insinuate himself into her emotional world, planting seeds of doubt and guilt that made her question her own perceptions, her own judgment, even the authenticity of the love she had once felt for him. And while she struggled to maintain composure in public, in private moments she wrestled with the crushing weight of fear and anger, feeling as though she were trapped in a labyrinth with invisible walls that shifted according to Ted's will. And just when she thought the situation couldn't become more unbearable, new information emerged from unexpected sources, A former colleague of Ted's mother calling with urgent whispers, a neighbor who had witnessed suspicious late-night visits, even digital footprints that revealed patterns of surveillance that were too methodical to be coincidence, all converging to paint a chilling portrait of a man who had long cultivated control over the women in his orbit. And when Shanice shared these findings with her mother, the relief of finally being heard was instantly tempered by the recognition that their combined efforts might not be enough to fully neutralize him, because Ted, clever and calculating, seemed always one step ahead, and every attempt to block him, to remove him from her life, was met with new methods of intrusion, subtle but undeniably invasive. A constant reminder that warnings alone could not undo the damage of a predator skilled at manipulation. And as the tension escalated, Shanice discovered that the fight to protect herself was entwined with the fight to protect others, because Ted's pattern of behavior was not isolated to her alone, and with each revelation about his past, from abandoned partners to coerced friendships and hidden financial schemes, she realized she had inadvertently stumbled into a much larger, far-reaching web of control and deceit, one that required not only courage and vigilance but strategy, alliances, and a willingness to confront truths that were almost unbearable, and so she began to meticulously document every encounter, every strange message, every unexplained visit, building a fortress of evidence that might finally put an end to Ted's reach, while also grappling with the emotional toll of being forced to relive, day after day, the trauma that her mother had endured decades earlier. And even as Shanice found small victories, moments where Ted's attempts to manipulate or intimidate failed, the psychological strain remained, leaving her exhausted, anxious, and constantly alert, knowing that one lapse in awareness could allow him to regain the advantage, and yet she persisted, fueled by a combination of fear, determination, and the unshakable bond with her mother, who, having survived Ted once, now stood beside her daughter as both mentor and protector, teaching her the subtle cues, the warning signs, the instinctive measures that could help shield her from harm. And as word of the confrontation spread through Fairmont Crest, old allies and unexpected figures from both Ted's past and Shanice's life began to surface, each bringing fragments of the truth, each confirming suspicions, each contributing to a growing network of vigilance that slowly began to shift the balance of power. And in the midst of this unfolding drama, Shanice discovered an inner strength she had never known, a clarity of perception that allowed her to see through charm and manipulation, to anticipate moves before they were made, to respond with measured decisiveness rather than fear-driven reaction. And while Ted continued to test boundaries, to push, to threaten with subtleties that could have destabilized anyone less prepared, Shanice's growing confidence and her mother's guidance created a shield both tangible and psychological, proving that awareness, preparation, and unwavering belief in one's own instincts could turn even the most insidious threat into a challenge to be overcome. And as Beyond the Gates hurtled toward its next seismic twists, the words "stay away from him" had transformed from a desperate plea into a mantra of survival, a declaration of agency, a line that, once crossed by Ted, would no longer be ignored. And even as the stakes escalated, even as the psychological warfare intensified, even as whispers of Ted's past manipulations threatened to fracture Shanice's world, she stood resolute, aware that she was not just fighting for herself, but for every woman who might one day face someone like Ted. And in that knowledge, she found a power that fear could not touch, a clarity that manipulation could not distort, and a courage that no amount of charm or intimidation could break. And so the struggle continued, complex, unrelenting, and electric with tension, the shadow of Ted looming but no longer omnipotent. And as Beyond the Gates raced forward, every choice Shanice made, every boundary she enforced, every alliance she forged became part of an intricate dance of survival, empowerment, and revelation, a testament to the resilience of those who refuse to be controlled, who refuse to be silenced, and who understand that sometimes the hardest battles, the most dangerous adversaries, and the most haunting pasts are the crucibles that forge unbreakable strength.